Paul Helm has been a senior research scientist at the Ontario Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in the Great Lakes Monitoring section of the Environmental Monitoring Reporting Branch for the last 10 years. So he's right up on it. He investigates emerging contaminant issues in the Great Lakes, the occurrence and fate of chemical contaminants, and approaches for contaminant monitoring. In addition, he represents the ministry at various provincial, national, and international committees on contaminants in the Great Lakes and also waterways. He received his PhD in chemical engineering from environmental engineering from the University of Toronto, which is a great university, by the way, which I graduated from way back when. His research focuses on persistent chemicals in the environment, primarily in the Great Lakes and surrounding atmosphere, but always is actively engaged in contaminant issues in the urban environments. He is presently located in Toronto, so he has come down for tonight's presentation, and his office is near the airport way. So I'd like to introduce Paul, and he'll go through the slides and everything and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for the introduction, and thank you to the committee for the invitation. I'm not Elizabeth May, and I'm not Gordon Miller, the Environmental Commissioner. I'm not near as dynamic a speaker as they are, but hopefully I can provide you some information about microplastics tonight, and give you a little bit of sense of the issue, a little bit about what we're doing about it, and then hopefully get a conversation going with you on where to go. I entitled the talk Contaminants You Can See because it's a bit of a play on words. First of all, my background is environmental contaminants like PCBs and KHs, chemicals that accumulate in the environment that you don't see. To analyze it, we have to go and extract this with a bunch of solvents and get it down into a little vial, put it on a $1 million machine, and it gives you little peaks that you have to believe are the chemical that you're looking at. In this case, it's something new for me. It's something I can actually see. I can look through a microscope and see. But also from a bit more philosophical point, it's a contaminant that, well, we don't really see the microbeads, but we've heard a lot about them. Yet the plastic that we see every day, blowing around the street, washing along the lake shore or the waterfront, we see all the time, yet it really hasn't attracted the same attention. And I find that kind of curious, and it's something that maybe we can talk about a little later. So I'm going to talk in ahead basically for the group. There's a bunch of us, we have a field unit at the Great Lakes unit that are out on the lakes all the time. They're on Lake Erie this year, so they've already been by Windsor about 2 weeks ago. We're doing our water quality monitoring and related work in the Great Lakes. There's a co-op student with us this year that's been the grunt, so to speak. She's spent a lot of time in the lab playing with peroxide to digest a lot of material to get these plastics out of the samples we collect, and she's sat in the microscope and tried to count it. She was with the talk last week. I introduced her as a student in the audience that's cross-eyed from looking at the microscope so much. So she's done the bulk of the work. John Tebow's in our group has done a lot for figuring out how to go about sample these and designing some equipment for us, and our field crew and students, and then a couple of people in the lab, just let me figure out which button here, that have helped with some of the analyses, I'm chemist, right, so I don't look through a microscope very often, so people to provide us guidance on how to go about looking at these things. So for tonight, I'm going to give you a good overview of the microplastics issue, I hope. How many in the audience have actually, before tonight, before the announcement, heard about microplastics or heard media reports? So, okay, so I don't have to go into too much details. But how many people heard the CBC interview today on the way in the afternoon drive? Anyone? How'd that do? Did I trip too much on that? It came out better than I thought it did when I got off the phone, I have to say. But I want to talk about the issue in a fair bit because I find what happens is, and it happened on that interview this afternoon, was it was introduced as microplastics, these things that wash our face and help us look pretty, are having a huge impact on the Great Lakes. And that's the kind of thing that's stated. And I basically, one of the reasons why I do these talks is because I want to provide a little bit more of a balanced argument. Not to say that plastics shouldn't be out there, but also point out that there's more information out there. Some of what we hear can be viewed as being overstated. So I hope what I'm doing today is giving you a little bit more balanced information so that we can think a little bit more critically about the issue. I'll highlight some of the actions that have been taken already, specifically about microbeads. They're the ones that have been in the media quite a bit in the last few months. After after becoming aware of the issue, I've gone through a fair bit of the science that's been published over the last, in some cases, decades on the issue, and have a sense of what questions there are to direct towards the Great Lakes. I'll then describe some of the projects that we have undertaken ourselves and in collaboration with some other researchers to answer some of those questions. And I'll take you through how we do it. And I've mentioned that we basically just started doing this work this summer, so what I have is some preliminary results, and I will show them to you, but I have a lot of qualifiers. I'll highlight some of the challenges that we've come across, and then we'll talk about some of the things that are being done in general to address plastics, and also hopefully some thought about what we can do going forward. So I said that I come at this from a very different perspective. My background is chemicals that are dissolved in very trace amounts in the water, and I thought basically I got involved in microplastics because not because I knew anything about them before it hit the news, but because we look at one of the ways we're trying to monitor contaminants that's more effective and more efficient than taking lots and lots and lots and lots of water is we put out plastic. I'll do that a lot. Plastic little strips that go in the water and leave them out there for a couple of weeks. And chemicals that are in the water that don't like being in water, they like accumulating in organic substrates like plastic, like fat and fish, like sediments in the lake. Those move into this plastic. And so I pointed out when news articles started showing up and talking about contaminants that can accumulate in the plastics, we said, yeah, we know, because we've been putting plastic out in the lake for a while. In a way that we get it back, so we're not contributing to the issue, but so we know something about how contaminants behave and move into plastic. But it was these articles that I think it was your neighbors to the north in Sarnia. The Sarnia Observer had an article in early November 2012, and then the Toronto Star was a follow-up article at the end of November 2012 that highlighted the microplastic study that was being conducted by a group out of the State University of New York, finding high level of plastics or Great Lakes full of plastic. And I just want to highlight a couple of statements that were within the Toronto Star article, because it's going to kind of give some context to the discussion tonight. It said that 600,000 plastic pieces per square kilometer, nearly twice as much as in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, were found in the Great Lakes at some sites. So that sounds like a lot, right? Have people heard about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch before a couple of years ago? Well, you're further ahead than me, so I hadn't at all, right? So look at the Great Lakes freshwater, not salt water. And then the other statement was plastic pellets seem to attract and heavily concentrate. Another thing that's been said up to 1 million times. The concentrations of things like PCBs, pesticide, DDT, that from water that are known to be harmful to human health. So when you hear that, it sounds like, wow, we've got an issue that's plastics are directly impacting human health. 600,000 plastic pieces per square kilometer. To put that in context, 500,000 per square kilometer would be half a piece of plastic in 1 square meter. So your desktop, I see some students in the audience, right? Your desktop at school is probably about 1 meter square. So out in that lake, at some sites, you're finding up to half a particle of plastic in 1 square meter. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I don't think it's a very good thing, but it gives a little bit of context in terms of the numbers that you hear and what do they mean. So we'll jump into microplastics now. What are microplastics? Well, they're generally defined as particles of plastic that are less than 5 millimeters in size. Some will say from about 1/3 of a millimeter up to 5 millimeters. And the low end is really defined by how you sample for it. If you use a net that has very small openings, less than 0.1 millimeter, well, that's your bottom end. The plastics don't stop being there just because it doesn't stop at 0.3 millimeters. So there's a size range that's generally reported. There are smaller particles that are present, and people have started to look into that. The sources of these, you've heard a lot about microbeads in face products, hand cleaners, toothpaste, generally exfoliant, friction, things that application notes of friction there. You want some things to scrape off your skin cells. It provides that, so it's a substrate that provides that. But there are other sources, fibers, because a lot of us wear synthetic. If I move it away, I'm not used to a microphone, so just raise your hand in the elevator or something if you can't hear me. Line from fishing line, or I mean, there's so many applications that use fabrics of some kind that are artificial materials. Just litter and debris, straws, lids, plastic bottles, things that are out there on the roads. They get run over 100 times. They get washed down into storm drains. They gradually break down into smaller and smaller bits. And then there's also the raw feedstock polymer, which have you heard the term nurdles? So if you know, nurdles is another name for it. It's little beads. They're about 1 to 5 millimeters across. They're what companies that make the plastic things like the chairs we're sitting on, that molded form will be beads that go into their machines that are melted down and put in the form, and then harden again into plastic products that we want. So that's that feedstock that, as it is transferred from, say, truck to plant or train to plant, gets spilled on the ground, washed in the storm drains, etc. Just a picture of the net that's used is called a mantitrol. I'll talk more about that afterwards. To collect plastics that are floating on the surface of the water. This is a strand line, what's called a strand line. It's where the water comes up to, washing up on the beach. You see sticks and leaves and things like that. But you also see little plastic pellets in there and some fragments. So this is, I think that was a beach near St. Catharines, but you can see these things on many beaches. And I'll talk more about that as one of our colleagues is doing a lot of beach work. These are the kind of fragments that can be washed up on beaches as well. You start seeing that they're rounded, different shapes, different colors. So a lot of different sources. And that, for all I know, that may all be polyethylene, right? Polyethylene is one of the most used, the highest volume plastics out there. And it makes a lot of different things. You can add colors to it. So just having a color doesn't necessarily help you know where it's coming from. These can be from any number of debris items. And this is a zoom in of what's in some of the face products. So the beads are spherical, but they also have different shapes like fragments, and I'll come back to that. So the Great Lakes, there's, the last 2 years it's been in the news a fair bit about microplastics in the Great Lakes, but there is actually a fair history around microplastics, or plastic debris, marine debris, the different names that are used. Back in the early 70s, there's studies in the Sargasso Sea in the North Atlantic area off the coast of New England, different zones where they collected for microplastics in zooplankton nets. Plankton nets that are usually used to collect small sea life. And this is just an example of some of the different pellets. There's foam beads, there's some mesh, there's fragments, a lot of different types of plastics. And this goes back now about 40 years. In 1984, there was a marine debris workshop put together by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, I think is what NOAA stands for, in the U.S. So starting to bring together a lot of stakeholders and try to find ways to solve some of the issues that were highlighted as sources for this. The handling of the raw material pellets, waste was often dumped in the ocean by ships, but also by large coastal municipalities. In 1988 was the first mention of the notion that contaminants associated with the plastics can actually be accumulating into organisms. There was a study that was suggesting that PCB levels in birds were related to the amount of plastic that were found in seabirds. And then in the early 90s, there were studies out that talked about beads in hand cleaners. I don't know if some of you remember, at least when I was a kid, I remember my dad having a hand cleaner after working in the shop or whatever. It almost smelled like turpentine. It was gritty. There was polystyrene beads that was in that. So I think that's what these early studies were referring to, and referring to it as a minor source. And of course, since that time, there's been a lot more use of plastics that have grown exponentially. So including on the supermarket shelves. So the question nowadays is, well, how minor or not is that source from personal care products? As far as Great Lakes work goes, there's 2 studies that have been released about microplastics in the lakes. One was in 2011 from a study that was conducted in 2012 along the shores of Lake Huron. It was by Patricia Corcoran, who's a researcher at the University of Western Ontario, now I think it's just Western, in London, Ontario. At Capital Pension in the Globe and Mail, the Lake Huron Center for Coastal Conservation, they have a report that highlights this. And they mentioned that really since 2007, they've been finding pellets washing up on the shores of Lake Huron. And then what has really captured the attention of the media since 2012, but even in the US in 2011, this group, Sherry Mason and the State University of New York, was funded for research. They were very active in advertising that they got this funding, that the work they were going to do. And then before their results were published in the science literature, which means it would be peer reviewed by other scientists in the field, again, a number of media reports starting to state what the findings were, and that's what found its way into the newspapers here in Canada as well. And so very, very, very good at advocacy, which is great, highlights the issue, and it's changed what I do now for at least a while. In 2012, they started a cruise up in Lake Superior. They're on a great U.S. anchor, I think it was. It's a War of 1812, 1814 sailing vessel that they had restored, and they were doing science work for the course with the students on it. So it's a great way, actually, to learn about science and explore the lakes, for sure. They started in Lake Superior, went down through Lake Huron, and in through Lake Erie, and they were pulling this manta net. I'll show you better pictures of the net that would skim the surface. They would pull it for 2 to 3 or 4 kilometers, and then they would collect a lot of material, which I'll show you. And in the end, they end up with a bunch of plastic, small particles, of which a good portion of that is plastic. You can't see the scale, but this is where they're saying up to 600,000 particles per square kilometer. With the larger, the dot, size of the dots represents the amount. So the larger dots are here in Lake Erie, which means that basically where there was more population, you're starting to see more plastics further through the lakes. I want to highlight, this is the Water Brothers. Has anyone heard of the Water Brothers? Oh, we have a couple of hands. I'm telling them that though. They have a series, the last 2 seasons they've had a series on TV Ontario. They've done 6 episodes per year. They came out when this vessel was in 2013 in Lake Ontario off Toronto. They came out on board and did a bit of filming. They have an episode on plastics. It was filmed on this vessel. It was in Lake Ontario, but it was filmed in the North Pacific, the Pacific Gyre. And they're with Marcus Erickson from the Five Gyres Institute. They talk about the issue of microplastics a fair bit and debris in the Pacific. So if you go to Water Brothers, search Water Brothers on Google, they do have the episodes on their website if you're interested, which it's a good overview of the issue in the oceans, and they start talking about some solutions as well. So you don't have to only take my word for it. As I mentioned, the group at Fredonia continued their studies in Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan last year. I was out with them mainly because I knew nothing about it. I wanted to see how it was done and learn from them. And so there will be more data coming for Lake Ontario and for the other lakes as well, and we're continuing the studies. So as a result of that study and a lot of education and outreach by groups such as the Five Gyres Institute and Plastic Soup Foundation, organizations like yourselves that have the Great Lakes and Singular Cities Initiative is another one. You know, mayors sending letters to companies and for provincial, federal governments financially to start getting some action on this, right? Identifying the microbeads are present in the lakes. They're coming from products that don't need to be there. That's the argument. And as a result of that kind of public awareness and advocacy, the industry has said, you're right, we can find alternatives. And so many of the companies have committed to remove them from the products starting in January 2015. I think Unilever was one of the first to say so. Others have followed suit. And they've made various timelines from 2015 to 2017. And then recently, so Illinois, different states have started to pass legislation or introduce legislation to ban the use of these products in personal care products as a follow-up. So Illinois was the first. New Jersey, I think, has legislation that's through now that has to be signed off on. And then New York is following suit as well, and other states. There's been discussions in Europe. I don't think there's been any action in Europe yet from a legislative standpoint. Basically the timeline for the bans is 2018 to allow, to ensure that the companies follow up on their commitment to remove them. So from the microbeads, a fair bit has already been happening. So we can talk about that more. So going through the science that has been done over the last 40 years, a number of questions come to mind that can be addressed with respect to the Great Lakes. So remember that We don't actually know very much yet because there's, other than one study collecting it on water in the Great Lakes and another having some pellets wash up on beaches, we haven't actually done very much yet. We don't know the scope and scale of the problem. So that's one of the first questions. Okay, we know the particles are there, but are they polyethylene, polypropylene? What plastic are they? What is their source? I'm going to do that one. How do they vary? Do what we see in the water, actually what we see in the sediment as well? Are they there in smaller particle sizes? What is the pathways of these? So we've talked about some of the sources, but what is the most important source? Because we're going to act and try and have some management of this, whether through stakeholder interaction or legislation. We want to get it right and know what's the best bang for the buck, what's the best way to manage this. And then what are the role of consumer products and through wastewater? Is that the dominant source? Are there spills? What's the frequency? This is some information we can start gathering. Are they in the sediments? From a chemical contaminant point of view, the sediments have played a very important role in the Great Lakes because contamination from the 60s and 70s ends up in the sediment and stays there for a long time. So are microplastics like chemicals? Is this just another thing that ends up in the sediments that becomes brought into food in that way? So these are some of the questions that are worth looking at. We get questions because the ministry deals with drinking water a lot. We get questions about drinking water. There have been no studies on drinking water because it's been a marine issue. Of course, we don't drink salt water. But what the drinking water engineers tell me is that the drinking water processes are tested by using small particles of microplastic to ensure removal. So they use small polystyrene spheres to ensure that particles such as pathogens, microsystems, things that we don't want in drinking water that cause sickness are removed. And so drinking water plants are effective at removing down to 1 to 2 micrometers in size. Are Great Lakes fish and organisms ingesting plastic? And what is the role of plastics for contaminant exposures? That's something that is picked up in the media a fair bit. And are these microplastic bits causing adverse impacts? Are they having a quote-unquote huge impact on the Great Lakes? And so I'll talk a little bit more about those last 2 points in that where the science is at the moment on that. I think in the introduction, trying to talk about some of the larger plastic items it's very apparent that there's effects. So there's your beer can holders, right? I've shamelessly pulled these off the internet. So if you want more pictures, Google Images is great for showing you lots of pictures of entanglement with different organisms, and it's quite stark. Popularized even by, everyone watch Happy Feet or Happy Feet? Yeah, so there's, the chief penguin, wrapped the king because he's got something around his neck. So those large debris items, we can definitely document impacts. The organisms are getting caught in these, and it's causing a real impact on their survival. There's a seabird that it's full of plastic, things like bottle caps, a lighter, and again, there's images of these. I think this is an albatross. Images on the internet that show you this. So that's well documented. Fish from, when they've looked at fish from the English Channel, from the North Pacific, a number of fish do have particles within them. I think the next picture actually. Yeah, there's one from the Five Jars website that they collected out on the Water Brothers show that picture as well. So those are plastic bits that were found in that fish. There have been lab studies that have been done. Some that show when organisms take up those plastics, it can impede their nutrition, so they're getting full from plastic instead of taking up things that they get energy from and nutritional minerals and vitamins from. Some of these lab exposures have been very small particles. They've shown that organisms like worms, mussels, small organisms like zooplankton, all fish food basically, they can take up these particles, but they also excrete them. In the lab setting, they tend to be very small. So there's kind of a gap as to, okay, we can show organisms are accumulating or taking these in, but not necessarily able to show what the effects are. So there's what I'm saying, I usually have a picture, so I just have to go a little further. These are small microbeads that fluoresce under special light, and I think it's called an amphipod. They basically are filter feeders. They're taking in anything in the water, and in this case, they'll take in the plastics, but they pass right through. Again, lab tests have shown that if you go really small, for some organisms, not others, you can actually find that they do enter the circulatory system. So this is of a mussel, and I think they were fed around 4 micron size particles. Trophic transfer, so when one organism feeds on or takes in plastic, the organism that eats it, does it get plastic as well? Well, they've shown that in the lab that it can, in this case blue mussels and crabs that feed upon them. With the mussels having plastic in them from having it in the water, crab eats the mussel, and the plastic is then shown to be in the digestive system of the crab for 2 or 3 days until it clears. So these things are shown, but we don't know what's happening here in the lakes and how pervasive that is, and whether or not it is an issue in and of itself. And it depends on the organism, it depends on the size of the particles. Some studies will say there may be a bit of an effect from this plastic particle at this concentration. Other organisms don't show it. It depends on the plastic that's used, it's dependent. So there's a lot of variables that are just starting to be explored. So I try to point out today with CDC that it's easy to show that these things are there. It's not so easy to show what kind of effect they are. So it's very difficult to make claims that it's having a huge impact at this point. I don't think we should let that get in the way, though, of starting to do something that seems very responsible, which would mean that plastic's out there. Perhaps it shouldn't be. The other thing you hear a fair bit about is contaminants adhering to the plastic or absorbing into the plastic, and that being transferred to organisms. I was, after speaking about this last week, the person was telling me that, they got the impression that, through the media, that the PCBs and DDT being in the plastic was new, that these contaminants being in the lake shouldn't be there, that all these plastics are bringing them in, and all of a sudden we have this contamination. Well, if you know the history of contaminants in the Great Lakes, you know that the concentrations we see in fish now are much, much, much lower than what was there in the 60s and 70s. The PCBs, the DDT that is absorbing to that plastic is already in the system. It's in the sediment, it's in the water in very, very trace quantities. It ends up in the fish. We, as a ministry, we monitor how much is in sport fish. We have the sport fish guide eating Ontario sport fish, how much you can eat safely given the contaminant levels. So we know, even if contaminants come from the plastic, we account for it in our monitoring. It's more likely that the chemical that is in the water also wants to go into that fish food and absorb into the fat of that fish food, which the fish then eats and digests, and those chemicals then can go in the system. Whereas the plastic particle, even if it goes through the fish, it's not digested. So there's a lot of speculation. This is was deemed a critical review in a journal that speculated, so to me it's an opinion piece, that contaminants from plastic kind of add to this. As you go up the food web and go to fish at the top of the food web, you have some portion of the chemicals in that fish coming from plastics. And I'm not sure that's the case. And the only point I want to make is, I don't want the arguments about whether or not contaminants from plastic, I don't want that to direct research agenda. We want to focus on what can we do to manage it. We don't want to kind of get lost in the weeds, so to speak. We want to focus on the issue at hand. So the aims of the studies that we've started doing, either sampling that we're doing or research that we're funding, will hopefully help answer some of those key questions. And the main one being, what is manageable? Where is it coming from? What are the sources entering the lakes from Ontario? The Ontario government's not saying that for now. And does action that we've talked about that's been taken on microbeads, does that actually solve the problem? Or are there other manageable sources, other things that we could be doing to help reduce that plastic out there right now? The other is, where does it end up? If we're targeting one thing that floats in the water and the sediments have a lot more plastic of a different type, then we're missing the boat there as well. So let's have a good characterize it. Let's try to characterize the problem in its entirety. I put this picture up. My background's contaminant feed, so chemical enters the water from the atmosphere or through a pipe. It then goes either into the sediments or exposure to fish, or goes down the river and it becomes someone else's problem. And the reason why I put that there is just, well, let's understand a little bit better about what's happening to that plastic as well. There's been claims about it building up in the Great Lakes, higher and higher concentrations. It doesn't go away. Well, more and more studies are starting to show that maybe it does. at least change where it is. So I'll get a little more specific with the projects that we're doing. We are collecting some samples from wastewater treatment plants in Ontario that are working with collaboration. Sherry Mason, who I've mentioned at State University of New York. She's doing similar work at plants in New York State, so that we have an idea of what's coming into Lake Ontario from both sides of the border. That's a picture of, again, off the web. It's very typical of wastewater treatment plants here in Windsor, Toronto, and elsewhere in Ontario. The sample that we collect on sieves, we end up with a small bit, and this was in the summertime, so there's a fair bit of algae in the water as well. And that's the sample we take and isolate. The work we're doing in the near shore of the lakes, we're sampling a few sites this spring, late spring, summer, and fall, using a manta trawl, pulling that behind the boat, which skims the surface and collects the debris. The reason why we're looking close to urban centers is that's where the sources are, that's where we are, that's where the products that we use are. So let's have a good handle at closer to the source. And then we're looking at the sediments with the project. We provided funding to Patricia Clark Grant at Western. We're also providing some samples. She's collecting some of her own samples. These are sediment traps that are put out in April and they're collected in November. If the wind never stops blowing, so the boat can go out there and do it. The material that comes in from the watershed, if it's near a river, or from resuspension, just throughout the season, it settles, and then we can take that, and so we'll get an idea of what plastic has come into the system over the season. And then sediments integrate over a longer period of time. So that 3 or 4 centimeters of sediment might represent 5 to 10 years of inputs. So it's a good way for us to kind of collect what is in the system or what's coming down into the sediments in the system. So I indicated a little bit about how we collect it. So we pull the manta trawls, or we use some kind of device to go down and grab the sediment, or we pump through some sieves in the wastewater treatment plant. I'll show you this where we end up with material either in the net or on the sieves. That material we take and we digest with, first we sieve out some of the particles. And you can already see there's a film of a wrapper, there's a chunk of red plastic, some styrofoam that is already breaking down, and you can see bits of it. A lot of leaves and peas, seeds, as well as some larger debris. We digest it using peroxide, hydrogen peroxide. So the stuff you buy in the shopping drug mart or drugstores is about 3%. We're using 30 to 35%, so it's fairly corrosive. Idea being is it's digesting up the little critters, the small bits of leaves and algae, and leaving the plastic, which is resistant to it. We then wash it. So this is showing some zooplankton that was in the sample. There's several hundred pieces of plastic in there as well that you can't tell. Digest it away, and then we end up with, after rinsing away the material, 2 size fractions of plastic. So this is about 300 microns, 0.3 millimeters up to 1 millimeter. This is 1 millimeter up to 5 millimeters. And then to analyze it, we put it under microscopes. There's a view under a microscope. These are mostly all plastic particles. Sometimes there's a bit of bug parts or some woody material that doesn't degrade as well in the digestion. So you have to kind of sort through that in your accounting. And under the microscope, it's categorized by whether it's a fragment, large gram shape, a pellet or microbead, foam, fiber, or film. And then after that, we would take some of those particles and put them on what's called an infrared analysis. And all that means is that it fires a little bit of a beam, infrared beam, at the particle that we put on a crystal, and it gives us the pattern. So each polymer has a distinctive pattern. So for polystyrene, you see what's called bands, little bands that are distinctive for polyethylene, and then different bands giving a distinctive fingerprint for polystyrene. So we get an idea of at least what kind of polymer we're sampling. And so just to show you one of the beads, this was taken out of a wastewater treatment plant sample. That bead was polyethylene. We see the distinctive peaks here and here. But depending on the sample, there's also a lot of other material. You can see kind of coating the bead. that can interfere with that as well. And so we try to get it as clean as possible to be able to distinguish the plastic. So I'm just going to show you now over the next few slides some of the preliminary results from sampling that we've been doing. This is a wastewater treatment plant sample. This is what it looked like. It's the green is algae. So what is a wastewater treatment plant? Well, it's a big pond, basically, artificial pond that has a bunch of nutrients in it remaining from the treatment process, sitting out there in the sunlight. It's great for algae. So they definitely have algae coming to the plant. That gets adjusted away. We sampled with a net this time, and it was about 6 or 12,000 liters of water. And in those samples, we found about 60 pieces of plastic. Most of them we categorized as beads, although there were some fragments. So that makes sense. Microbeads used in personal care products is washing down the drain, some of which are coming out of the plants. I want to mention that, again, some of the things that are said are these things that wash down the drain, they go right through the plants. Plants are designed to remove the plastics. The treatment plants are designed to remove solids. There's a lot of settling that goes on, although there has been no study yet to actually look at removal efficiency. So what we see coming out of a wastewater treatment plant may very well be a very small fraction of what is captured by the wastewater treatment plant. This is just under the microscope of some of these particles that we found. This was the bigger size fraction, and I just want to emphasize these were 8 pieces in that one sample, of which only 2. This one is a piece of styrofoam, polystyrene, and this one is a polyethylene bead. The rest are little bits, which you can use your imagination what some of the bits might be, right? Pieces of almond, sesame seeds, apple skin. We've seen all kinds of things. This is in the smaller size fraction. What this material is kind of a fatty resin that's left after we digest a lot of the algae. And you can see different colors of beads that are there. So that smaller size fraction definitely has a bunch more of the beads. That's where we're finding the smaller size fraction has more plastic bits. So we've looked at a couple samples, but we're sending our samples off to Sherry Mason. So we'll put that data together over the next few months and have a good picture of around what's happening around Lake Ontario in this case. For our sampling on the lake, we've done about 6 sites this year. As part of our routine monitoring, we're in Lake Erie most of the time this year, and we do 3 different visits where we do stations from Lake St. Clair all the way through to Fort Erie that are visited for water monitoring purposes, sediment collections. There's a whole suite of different tests that are done, and they visit that 3 times a year. So at some of those sites, each of those times they've come through, we've done a trawl. So Western Bay, the closest samples come here off Western Basin of Lake Erie off Amherstburg, but off the Grand River mouth as well, and kind of a background site at Lake Erie. And then Toronto Harbour and Humber Bay and Hamilton Harbour is kind of they're a little bit more enclosed, a stronger influence of stormwater, wastewater, river inputs than some of the other sites. So this gives you just an idea. We've done like a track where we're pulling out from Toronto Harbour, and I'll zoom in here from Humber Bay. In this case, the 2 lines are 2 different. We're using the same track each time that we've come, spring, summer, and fall. And in the case for Humber Bay, we've got Humber River coming in. Here's the wastewater treatment plant out fall. So we're trying to capture the range of ways that these materials may be coming into the system and integrating it. So hopefully help tease out what the major contributors are. So for the site off in the Western Basin here, it's a fair bit ways offshore. And it's still about, I want to say about 80 meters of water, so it's fairly shallow. And then that's the cruise track we followed. And it's about, I think this one was about 2 kilometers. The examples, I was trying to go through the pictures and see if I had examples from the Western Basin one, but of course, those are the pictures I couldn't find. So I'm showing you Toronto, but it's very typical when we're pulling the manta net that you get a lot of leaves. So here's, it's called the cod end. That's where a lot of material comes up, but in this case, it's full right up to here of leaves, of branches, of twigs. You see them in these bottles. So these were 2 4-liter bottles of material, and you can just imagine looking at a student's face when we brought that in. And here, you got to sift through this for plastic. So it's a bit of a chore for sure. But when she did all that, and again, this is the Humber Bay, one of the Humber Bay samples. This is now under the microscope, and this is pretty much all plastic. So in this case, there was, I'll get to the data next, but there's 7,000 pieces of plastic in one sample. These are very small, less than 1 milliliter. If you look close, you'll see some rounded particles in there that resemble beads. There's definitely some fiber material. A lot of these they look like shavings, fragments, shavings. They look like mechanical things that are broken up. So what it drives home for us is there are other significant sources that are contributing to what we find in the lake. The microbeads are contributing, but depending on where you look and when, it may not be the major source. So it tells us that there's other things that we would want to include in managing this. I should also mention that the plastic we go through, we use that IR analysis to verify whether or not some of these are plastic. So the counts that I'm giving you now, at this point we've been counting, but we haven't done all the IR analysis. So the counts may change a little bit as we verify, especially for fibers. Fibers are the hardest ones to verify, both for the instrument, on the instrument sensitivity, but also because by eye, a lot of fibers, we can't tell whether it's cotton or natural fiber, or if it's a woody fiber, or if it's polymer. So the results may change a little bit, but I think you'll find that the trend is there. And that trend is basically, the closer you look to the larger urban areas, the higher your numbers are. People always want to know numbers. I was asked in two interviews today, how much are we finding out there, what numbers are you finding? In this case, we're finding over 5 million particles per square kilometer. Other than comparing to what Sherry Mason's study showed, we really can't compare that. So, that number, if it was a chemical, if I was finding 5,000 micrograms per liter, we would be able to take that and say, okay, here's what the toxicity studies are saying. At that concentration, there may be an effect to fish. Well, we can't do that for plastics. There's no information to tell us whether or not that's a lot or if that's not very much in terms of whether there's effects. And because there's only one other study, well, we don't know if that's a typical thing or not. The highest sample that Sherry found was near Buffalo and was kind of in the range of what we find at eastern Ontario. And then the urban areas are a fair bit higher. We're closer to the source instead of out in the middle of the lake like she was. The other thing we look at is, well, what are the shapes of these plastics? So the blue is fragments. The red is beads, and in beads this time it really is the spherical shapes that we're finding. And then the other are lines and fibers. So again, here's the Grand River at 2 different time frames. In the spring we were in the plume. You could very clearly see the plume in the lake. So we were sampling where the river water was. And that river water, there's a lot of wastewater treatment plants on the ground. So we saw more beads. In the summer, the plume wasn't in the same location where the cruise track was. And so it shows you that depending on wind, currents, you're going to find a very different answer. And the numbers are also very different for those two samples. The spring had quite a higher number of total plastic compared to the summer, just because we weren't getting the river influence. But the other take-home message is that fragments were a very dominant feature, not so much the beads. But I want to qualify that a little bit and say that depending on what you call a fragment and what a bead is a little bit subjective. So these were beads under the microscope that are spherical, and this is a product that's, I think it's Clean and Clear that I bought at Loblaws, that has microplastic in it, but it has two shapes. It has this kind of cloud or asteroid shape, if you will, white plastic that looks a lot like a fragment, and it has a bead. And even some of the other products have, sharp edges, this odd-shaped particle. Well, if you're looking under a microscope and you're trying to count a few hundred to a few thousand of these, well, what do you call a fragment? What do you call a bead? And if that's the way we're going to kind of sort out the sources, then we've got a bit of work to do, I think. And I'll just kind of take us to the end here by highlighting the other work. We're started to do some streams as well, again in the Toronto area, mainly to try and figure out how to do this. We're definitely encountering some problems when it's higher flow events. The nets just fill up so quickly that it's hard to get a representative sample. But for the samples we have taken so far, this is now number of particles per meter cubed, so it's a volume size instead of an area for the lake. And again, I don't know what the number means, but when I compare it to one other study that was just published from Chicago, they sampled, I think it was 4 samples above wastewater upstream of the wastewater treatment plant and 4 samples downstream, that the number of pieces of plastic that we find in our streams in Toronto, the Don River site being downstream of wastewater treatment plant, are very similar. So this is the average that they found downstream, average upstream, and then the dot represents their highest. So we're right in the same range that we're finding. And again, it's a little bit different profile, if you will, or makeup of the sample. That the fibers in this case seem to be the dominant feature, dominant source, and that doesn't seem to matter whether it's downstream of the wastewater treatment plant or if it's in creeks that aren't influenced by wastewater. So as we sort through the samples and confirm what those materials are, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out as well. And I'll just finish up by saying there's definitely more to come. So this is a picture from a study from the St. Lawrence River, where a group looked at sediments. Some first student went through and picked out with tweezers under a microscope all the spheres so they could find a sample of sediment. There was a number of beads there. So all of which are polyethylene, by the way. So polyethylene, which usually floats on water, obviously if it's in the sediment under the water, it can sink. And as particles of plastic, particles of anything actually, become coated with a biofilm, bacteria, and that form naturally on things in the water, sediment and sand gets attached, that changes the density and they sink. I just mentioned the study that did a bit of work in the rivers. It's the only other freshwater sample now in the Great Lakes region, is this one in the streams. But there is a fair bit more to come. So there's the studies we're doing. There's Sherry Mason has been working with the United States Geological Survey to look at stream inputs from rivers around the Great Lakes on the US side. She's also conducting a study looking at fish from the Great Lakes and that, I guess, the Lake Ontario region. I'm not sure for all lakes fish, but she's gone up to 18 species now. And she's also doing cormorants. She's putting it forward as a food web study. So we'll start to find out whether or not are more particles present as you move up the food web, what species are ending up with these particles in them. And then there's a group at the University of Michigan that's received some funding to do environmental health work as well. So that's one of the ones I know about. I'm sure I know, but I don't know. I haven't covered all the ground. Some of the things that we've encountered are mentioned in the nets. That, it is a challenge sampling for these things. It's also a challenge getting out the plastic when you've got so much other material. I showed you the top picture already, but this is another one from the Grand River. We found a fair number of plastic particles, but that's all zooplankton. So that's actually all fish food. And there was grams and grams of material there that fish are feeding upon. And in there's a few bits of plastic. So getting that plastic out and putting it into context is a bit of a challenge. I mentioned that reproducibility and kind of that judgment of whether it's a fragment or a bead, and how you compare data between studies. These all come into play because we're still figuring out how to classify these things. So hopefully to generate some discussion after I'm done blabbing on here. I just wanted to point out that there are things that are put forward as things that we can be doing, and there have been for quite a while. The one that's received the most attention again is the microbeads. So if you look on labels, you'll see things like polyethylene or microbeads, plastic microbeads, things on the ingredient list that you can avoid. And people have started doing that already. And as I said, the companies have committed to withdrawing that from the products. As a bit of an aside to that, it was pointed out to me, well, one of the reasons why companies have gone to microbeads is cost is one factor. It's very cheap. But some of the products that use natural, you probably apricot shells, oatmeal, things like that, natural products, there may actually be more issue with allergic reactions for some people. So there may actually be more human issue with some of the things that are incorporated in products that are natural as opposed to microbeads. So it's food for thought. It also points out at times that you kind of have to balance a number of things. I personally don't use exfoliating soaps, so it doesn't matter what's in there. Why not get rid of the plastic? As a kid, I remember seeing signs all over the place in rural Ontario that was, this kind of sign, don't throw away things because you're going to be fine. And it seemed to be, I remember being very cautious about that as a kid. I'm not sure that I'm that way as much anymore. I don't go throw everything over my shoulder, but I also don't bend over and pick it up. The whole psychology around litter, things we see all the time, how effective are we at cleaning up our litter, disposing of our litter?
ways that maybe can help change that. Things like the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup that engages students, engages people to get out to the beaches and see that nest. I came across a person on Toronto Island one day as I was cycling with my family, and they were from University of Western Ontario, as it turns out, a group that were there going around the island and picking up plastic along the shoreline. Toothbrushes, bottles, I mean, you name it, things you don't want to really think about, you're finding it there. And really, is it so difficult to put in a garbage can? So there's things that we can be doing. I think, I don't remember the author, but the author of the Don't Sweat the Small Stuff series, one of the stories I remember him telling was, you see around his home, there's in a rural area, waste that's in the ditches and along those roads, and he just started picking up the garbage and picking up the garbage. And gradually, a couple weeks later, when he's out for a walk, he notices his neighbor picking up garbage, and their neighbor that's a couple miles down the road. But, well, I saw you out one day, so I started doing it as well. And it just kind of drove home the point that, if we lead by example, perhaps the rest will follow as well. But that will only take us so far. So there's other things that are talked about, and the Water Brothers episode that I mentioned talks about it as well. Things like product stewardship, so that companies consider that life cycle of product. So not just the coffee that plastic and leave us to dispose of it. Why not incorporate a structure that we're not going to throw out altogether? Or is there alternative materials? The point's been made that depending on whether there's different types of biodegradable plastic. Some means they degrade to smaller bits of plastic more rapidly, so that might actually create more of a problem. Or if you have a polymer that does become a food source for natural microorganisms that just gradually disappear, can that be incorporated into more materials? I gave the example of the marine debris workshop back in the 1980s. It led eventually to a declaration by the Global Plastics Associations for solutions for marine litter. It was signed by the Canadian Plastics Industry Association president. That's on a kind of a large global scale. Well, perhaps there's something that we should be doing at the local watershed scale or municipality scale or provincial scale that engages stakeholders again to manage some of these different sources and reduce them.